Hey guys, it's QuickyBaby and welcome back to World of Tanks, and today I've got a full tank review for you on the Tier 8 Japanese heavy tank, the Yoho. Are you the kind of person who likes their tanks to look a little different? With a monstrous 150mm capable of removing gigantic slabs of health from your opponents? Or laugh as puny little tanks fail to pen you again and again and again? So if that sounds like your cup of tea, stick around. I've got some Ace Tanker gameplay coming right up after I analyze the statistics, and if you have no interest in playing this absolute gargantuan vehicle, then I'll show you how to take them out effectively on the battlefield. The Yoho was a further development of the Japanese super heavy tank idea, with a plethora of guns that would have allowed it to engage opponents from all angles. However, the project was discontinued due to the war ending, and this machine never made it into the prototype stage, let alone seeing combat. The Yoho is visually similar to the previous tank, the Oni, that you will have had to have played through to be able to get to the Tier 8 Japanese heavy tank. The Yoho is 20 tons heavier than its Tier 7 predecessor, and its side profile is actually much smaller, which is very useful considering its side armor is its main weakness. I should also highlight that its side armor is 50% thicker than on the Oni, which is 70mm along here, while the Yoho is 105mm. One of the interesting things about the Tier 6, Tier 7 and Tier 8 Japanese heavy tanks is that they all have two different competitive guns. On the Tier 6 OI, you had to choose between using a 10cm and a 15cm gun, but then when you get to the Oni, you get an improved 10cm gun, but the same 15cm gun that you used on the Tier 6 tank, and it is the same when you get to the Tier 8 Yoho, which is the vehicle in question for this review. You can use the same 15cm that you used on the previous two tanks, or this improved 10cm gun. Now, while this 10cm gun that you unlock on the Yoho looks way better than that of the Oni, at least with regards to its rate of fire, firing an extra 1.45 rounds a minute, and its alpha damage is 330, the same as on the Oni, there is one serious drawback of this gun, and that's that it can't fire any premium ammunition. It only has two types of ammo. It can use AP rounds and high explosive rounds, and its AP ammunition have got 215mm of penetration. And 215mm of penetration just isn't enough to compete with many Tier 9 vehicles, let alone Tier 10 heavies. And so while at least for me I prefer to use the 10cm guns on the OI and the Oni, it's really starting to push it to have such low penetration when you're a Tier 8 tank that can meet Tier 10 vehicles quite often. So I'm going to compare the Yoho for both the 10cm gun and the 15cm gun before showing you some gameplay examples of the differences. So immediately, don't be fooled about the DPM disparity between these two guns. The only reason why the DPM on the 15cm is so unbelievably high is because it's got 910 alpha damage, but only 75mm of penetration, and so you're not likely to be able to do that with every shot. Realistically, if you shoot the front of very heavily armored vehicles, you're going to do about 200 to 250 damage, up to about 400 damage if you're shooting tanks with medium kind of armor. But then again, when you do penetrate, it's just so darn sweet to do that 910 average, ranging up to over 1000 if you roll high. So the rate of fire with the 10cm gun is 6.45 rounds a minute. With the 15cm gun, it is 3.53 rounds a minute. Now remember, if you're shooting at those well-armored heavies and you're only doing 300 damage a shot, that probably means you're only going to be doing about half the DPM to them that you would be doing if you were penetrating them with the 10cm gun. With regards to aim time, there's not actually much difference between these two guns considering the large disparity in their caliber. 3.1 seconds aim time on the 10cm and 3.3 seconds on the 15cm. Accuracy-wise, that 10cm is not particularly great for a gun with 330 alpha damage, but at least it's a hell of a lot better than the 15cm with 0.54. But then again, considering that you don't even really have to hit a weak point with that 15cm gun, only just roughly hit anywhere on the vehicle and still do consistent damage, I personally found it just so much more comfortable to use the 15cm rather than the 10cm. One thing that's incredibly frustrating about the Yoho is that directly over the front of the tank, where generally you want to be facing your gun, you can only depress it about 3 to 5 degrees. It's immensely frustrating. And if you want to use your gun depression over the left side of your vehicle, you have to expose such a large amount of your armor, and that makes it very ineffective. Even more bizarre is the fact that the front turret is not actually directly in the center of the hull, and that you have no turret on the right-hand side of the tank. And so what you'll find with the OHO is it does so much better when shooting to the right, because you can actually effectively angle your armor while also depressing your gun. Now, the mobility of the OHO is not excellent. Its top speed limit forwards is 25 kilometers an hour and backwards it's 10 kilometers an hour, and that can be rather annoying at preventing your opponents from flanking you and getting your weak side armor. Luckily, it gets a very meaty engine, but this tank weighs 120 tons, which gives it a power to weight ratio of nearly flush on 10. Now, its ground resistances aren't really that bad at all, and this tank doesn't really feel like it's a super heavy. But trust me, it certainly isn't going to get anywhere quick. Now, of course, the strength of the Japanese heavy tanks is their armor, and the OHO gets 200 millimeters of frontal armor, which is way better than the Oni's 175 at tier 7. This 200 millimeters pretty much covers the entirety of the front of the tank. All of the turret is 200, even the tank boobs that we can see here are 200 millimeters. The lower plate is 200 millimeters, and the only part that isn't is this very well angled mid plate that's actually 105 millimeters thick. But because of its effective armor, your enemies are going to probably auto ricochet off here. And the only thing that you should be concerned about is high explosive rounds being dumped on here, or if your opponents are completely above you. So how about the side armor? Well, there's this area here which is 105 millimeters thick with no spaced armor over it. But the whole section of the lower hull is actually weaker. It's got 70 millimeters of armor, but 35 millimeters of spaced armor. A lot like the Oni, but at least you do have this upper area of 105, unlike the Oni where it's only 70 millimeters thick with no spaced protection. So what this means for the OHO driver is that you want to angle your armor pretty much like this, and this makes your lower plate 280 millimeters of effective armor while still maintaining 250 on your mid plate. But as we can see, be very careful about the front flat part of the turret because there's no spaced armor protecting it, and it's 200 millimeters thick. And so try and keep moving forwards and backwards so they ricochet off the very well angled and thick side armor. As we can see here, the side profile of the OHO is just so much better than the Oni, and it's one of the biggest differences between the vehicles. The Oni only had 35 millimeters of spaced and regular armor on the lower hull, and only 70 millimeters of protection on the upper hull, as well as only 150 millimeters of flat side armor. On the OHO, that goes up to 220 millimeters of armor in parts, with again this 105 and the 105 effective with the spaced and the regular armor combined. One thing to watch out for on the OHO is if you think its rear armor is very weak, well, it's not. It's still got 150 millimeters of rear armor, which is the same thickness as it was on the Oni. So OHO drivers should be careful. You're a whole tier higher now. Don't give up the rear of your tank as much as you did to those tier 5 and 6 vehicles. And so really what we see here is that you should never shoot the OHO in the turret or the mini turrets unless you have about 225 millimeters of penetration and are shooting a flat part of its armor. You have to get the side where you'll be able to feast on its hit points, or alternatively the rear if you've got about 160 millimeters of penetration plus and you hit it at a flat angle. I do have one great tip for taking out OHOs frontally, however, and that is the cheeks of the hull. We can see that they slant in at an angle here, and so that means when the OHO is trying to angle his front and his side very effectively like this, you can just shoot here on this whole plate. And all you need is about 220 millimeters of effective penetration to be able to reliably take out the tank. And if we look at the visual model, we can see this is a rather nice big flat plate to shoot. And OHO drivers should definitely keep moving as much as possible to avoid getting penned in this weak point. Thankfully, the OHO has a big slab of hit points to go with this armor of 1,700, which can allow you to weather a storm, and also 380 meters view range. But it's a little bit disappointing considering that's the same view range as we had on the Oni, and also only an extra 150 hit points when the Oni had 1,550, which in my opinion just feels so much better at tier 7 than the 1,700 the OHO has at tier 8. So you might be asking for recommendations of equipment to use on the OHO. Well, I thoroughly recommend you use a gun rammer and vertical stabilizers, and then your third option is a choice between either using coated optics, improved ventilation, or a gun laying drive. For me personally, I prefer to use improved ventilation on this tank, but with the rather long aim times, there are arguments to use the gun laying drive, and also having 380 meters view range if you want to be able to spot your opponents at such long distances, and considering the camouflage rating on this tank is beyond awful, then some people might like to use coated optics as well. So what about crew skills on the OHO? Well, firstly, I recommend taking repairs on all of your crew members. Then when you've reached your second skill, retrain your commander to get Sixth Sense and then take repairs on him again. Then when you reach your third skill, take Sixth Sense, Brothers in Arms, and remember it's a perk, you must take it on all of your crew members, and then repairs, and then try to focus on things like recon to be able to improve your commander's view range, and things like clutch braking to be able to improve your track traverse. Don't bother taking camouflage on this tank. The only reason why I did that is because this used to be my STB1 crew. You'd do far better taking pretty much all of the other crew skills. So anyway, I think that's quite enough theory crafting. Let's see how the OHO performs with the 10cm gun. So here we go, I'm playing on Ensk in the encounter version of this game mode, and remember, I'm using the 10cm gun. One thing that I'd also like to highlight about the difference between these two guns is that on the Oni, if you chose to use the 10cm gun rather than the 15cm gun, you actually got better gun depression over the mini turret. Where, however, on the OHO, when you choose to use the 10cm gun rather than the 15cm gun, you still get the really bad gun depression over the front here, as we can see. It's just so awkward to have that 3 to 5 degrees of gun depression on both of these guns on the OHO. And so that means that there's no reason to really use the 10cm over the 15cm, at least with regards to depression. Now, I think that Ensk is a great map for the OHO. It's not very big, and so that means that the slow speed of the OHO is not such a big deal. It doesn't take you very long to drive 600 meters, even if your top speed limit is only 25 kilometers an hour. Now, this is a lovely matchup for the tank. 6 of the enemy are tier 8, and then half and half of the remainder are tier 7 and tier 6. Now, oh gosh, that was pretty awkward, but that's what you get with 3.1 seconds of aim time and not the best accuracy in the game. Now, the T-34 puts his first shot into me. Where does he hit me? Can't quite make it out. Oh yeah, he hit me in the turret there, just to the side of my gun mantlet. But that T-43 comes back. Big mistake. We put a good shot into him. Now we start to side scrape. We managed to bounce off our first shot, however, from, I guess, the charioteer who came around the corner. Did 390 bounce damage off me there. Gosh, I was a bit frustrated there by the looks of it, as I missed the KV-85. Really, in these kind of matchups, every shot counts, and I wanted to maximize my damage. And those are the kind of hits that you can put in with the 10cm that, frankly, you couldn't put in with the 15cm gun. And that's really what I want to show you guys in this replay. What the strengths are of the OHO with regards to the armor, of course. But really, the main thing that you need to decide for yourself, because really my conclusion is that there is no correct answer about which gun you should use. You need to decide about which one that you will try and target. Now, we managed to bounce a T-44 from behind, and that's something that the OHO just does very well. It's got such good all-round armor that it just doesn't seem to give a monkeys when its opponents are shooting at it. Now, that T-34 is behind the wall. I'm going to try and shoot through the wall to be able to break it. But unfortunately, he's also behind, I think, a tree there as well, which means that I couldn't quite manage to get that in. However, this IS-6, he was just unable to penetrate my armor with his 175mm of penetration. Pretty obviously, I showed you guys in the garage that you need about 220 to even start to get through the front of the OHO. So this is what this tank does really well. Even though that KV-5 on the enemy team fired an APCR round at me, it didn't really help him, and the Borsig manages to shut him down. We put a good round into the T-34, and I'm just hoping that this KV-85 bounces off me as we come round and put a shot into his tracks. And so really, when you're playing the OHO in this kind of a matchup, you should be pretty fearless against the majority of the enemy tanks, apart from, say, the IS-3 with its 226mm of penetration, and the T-34 with its, like, 240, 250 even millimeters of penetration. And there's no surprise that the only tank has managed to penetrate me so far this game has been the T-34 with that big 120mm gun. So we're just hunting for the last shot on the T-34 there. Will we be able to find it? Yes, we will. Great. The main threat on the enemy team dealt with, and now we can turn around. We have been flanked. This has been a clockwise battle. Oh, no, sorry. It's been an anti-clockwise battle, right? Where our team has pushed along the eastern flank, and the enemy team have cut through the town and tried to surround us. So we've managed to do 2,000 damage here. I haven't been the luckiest, but then again, you don't really get... I should say that you get unlucky quite often with the OHO, considering it has very long aim time. Look at this. This is even with a great skilled crew. Its aim time is still pretty darn long. And its accuracy isn't the best as well. Do you see that? That was me trying to aim over the mini turret of the tank. And the gun depression is just so horrific. What you want to do is try and angle your tank like this and hope that your opponents are on your right rather than your left. It's so unbelievably awkward. And I really think that this 10cm gun would just be so much better if either A, it could fire premium rounds and therefore have good penetration in tier 10 games. Of course, you don't need premium rounds in this kind of matchmaking, and that's really what my conclusion is with the 10cm gun, that it's probably better to use this gun in this kind of a matchup where you don't need monstrous penetration to challenge your opponents. But what happens when they start to have about 240 millimeters of effective frontal armor? Then you're just going to have no chance of being able to penetrate them. Like an E75 would just look at you as this big, tasty snack. And I feel like if I'm playing the other tier 8 heavy tanks such as an IS-3 or even a Tiger II, that an E75 doesn't look at me as a big tasty snack. So of course I want to finish off the low health tanks first. That Oni is going to take quite a lot of shooting. And you know, he fired an AP round using the 150 millimeter against me, and I'm really not too bothered about him. I just wanted to press the gun to shoot at his cheeks. But you know what this is an example of? This is how bad the mini turrets are on this side of the tank. The mini turrets prevented me from shooting him. However, look, when I get my gun over the side, now I can get some fairly effective shots into his lower plate. I'm thinking about how best to use my armor right now. What I want to do is keep my rear armor towards him because it's still 150 millimeters thick, and the only place this guy can really penetrate me, considering he's firing AP rounds, is to shoot me directly in the side. However, I can depress my gun enough, and my penetration is more than enough to get through his 150 millimeters of rear armor, and we managed to chew up 1,304 damage against that Oni and pick up our 5th kill of the game. So a strong result here for the Oho with the 10cm gun when it is the top tier tank. Let's just take a quick look at the post-game stats before we look at some more gameplay to see how the 15cm gun performs. So a great result. This happened during a 3x experience event. This was 1,501 base experience points for our 4,362 damage done, 5 kills, 5,000 damage blocked by our armor, and we make a tremendous profit of 55,000 credits because the ammunition on this tank is rather cheap when you can't fire premium ammunition. Frankly, the Oho wasn't even really challenged in this matchup because there were very few tanks on the enemy team that can penetrate it, and many tanks on the enemy team that even if they fired APCR ammunition, such as the KV-5 or the IS-6, that just couldn't penetrate it anyway because they only get up to about 217 millimeters, which is not enough to contest the front of this tier 8 heavy. And that's really what the Japanese heavy tanks do. They just butcher this kind of matchmaking, especially when you use the 10cm gun. The problem is, however, is when you choose to use this 10cm gun, you're kind of just crossing your fingers and praying for this kind of matchup, because as soon as you have to meet any kind of stiff tier 9 and tier 10 opposition, you just can't really do anything to them frontally. It really is just absolutely bizarre that they give the Oho this unique 10cm gun and then they don't allow it to use premium ammunition, unlike pretty much 99% of all other tanks. Maybe they feel that the Oho would just be too dominant if it could also perform well in tier 10 games as well as tier 8. And so that means that it kind of increases the spread when you choose to use the 10cm gun dramatically. And for me, while I was playing it through for a while with the 10cm gun, I was really enjoying these kind of games where you felt like God, at least at first, and then you feel like it gets a little bit more boring. But was so immensely frustrated at feeling pretty much useless in many tier 9 and tier 10 games that I started to use the 15cm gun. And this is why. So this time we're using the 15cm gun again on Ensk, again in a nice matchup, but this time the majority of the enemy are tier 8, so we don't have any of those lovely juicy tier 7s and tier 6s that can't penetrate us. That's what you honestly feel like though when you're playing around in this tank. When you see a tier 6 and a tier 7, you kind of just prey on it. It's a pretty horrible kind of vehicle like that. But then again, I guess all of the Japanese heavy tanks are a bit like that. But again, this time, it might not look like it because the reticle bloom even is kind of the same on both of these guns. But your accuracy is, of course, not quite as good. But let's see what the 150mm does. Yeah, I don't think that T-34-3 is feeling very happy about himself. And I managed to bounce the first APCR round that hits our tank, sorry, the first heat round that hits our tank, but the next APCR round from the Super Pershing penetrates. And I think that was also a bingo roll by him. He rolled for 300 with a Super Pershing. That's a pretty good result. So this T-34-3 really can't like me very much right now, as he bounces 3 heat rounds off our vehicle. I think he's on track to actually lose credits playing a T-34-3 right now. And one thing that's great about this gun is that you can just casually shoot the front of the vehicle like this. Look how much damage this will do. Hold on, wait for it. Boom, I just shoot him in the front plate. No gun is really going to be able to penetrate that very reliably unless you've got about maybe... Gosh, you probably have to have about maybe 260 millimeters of penetration to be able to go in there. But we just did 300 damage to the front of his vehicle. And that's something that's very useful about effectively having a gigantic high explosive round that you can fire anywhere on the enemy vehicle and do consistent damage. But of course, if you want to hit the home run, you have to penetrate with 75 millimeters of high explosive rounds. So you still want to try and aim for the softer parts of the vehicle, because then you do 910 average damage. But if you can't find the soft parts of the enemy vehicle and you frankly just need to fire into them, then take your chances. I thought that would have done more. 226 damage to the side of the Super Pershing. But we get to ram him to death. There you go. That stops you from firing APCR at me, hey buddy. But I mean, I'm kind of joking around like that because really, you should fire APCR at these tanks. If you see Japanese heavies, you want to fire your premium rounds at them. So now I'm loading a heat round. This is very interesting because they have 150 millimeters of penetration. But they are heat, which makes them quite bad at going through tracks and spaced armor. Luckily for me, I fired slightly high up there on the Mutz, and I do 712 damage to him. Now the Mutz's side armor is actually very, very weak, and I would probably be able to get through the side of it with an AP round and possibly even a high explosive round, but I'm not complaining. Whenever I do 700 damage to a tier 8 tank, whatever. We put in another heat round, I believe, into that Panther 88. Again, a little bit unnecessary. We could have just used a high explosive round there. But in these kind of situations, when you've got quite a long reload and you want to try and get as much damage out of the game as you can, that's all right. One thing you might be noticing is that even though this tank does have this gigantic caliber gun, it actually fires quite quickly with 3.5 rounds a minute. And gosh, this game is just over 3 minutes long and we've done 3,000 damage and picked up 3 kills. And this FE304 is just going to run away to try and waste a little bit more of our day. And so this game we saw how the OHO dealt with being top tier tank using that 150mm. And I really think that I would have done more damage if I'd been using the 10cm gun in this game, because I would have probably been able to penetrate all of my shells. And when you think about how much time we spent shooting at that Super Pershing and also ramming him, and the fact that we only did 318 damage to him total, I would have been able to do at least 2 if not 3 shells into the side of him if I was using the 10cm gun, probably doing 1,000 damage to him rather than 318. But then again, I wouldn't have been able to do that whopping 712 damage hit to the side of the Mutz and that 900 damage hit into the side part of the T-34-3. And so even without the 10cm gun, we still picked up a fairly nice round here, 1,200 base experience points, again in just over 3.5 minutes. So how about when the OHO is not top tier? For example, we're playing on Arctic region against a bunch of tier 10 and tier 9 tanks. Let's see how this 150mm gun performs. Here we got a nice shot into the IS-4. 230 damage. Now, we took off his tracks, holding him in place for our team, but I think that we would have probably been able to penetrate that with only 215mm of penetration on the 105mm. However, this shell, I just don't think we would be able to penetrate that shot. Again, we managed to take his tracks off again and doing 390 alpha damage. Now remember, our rate of fire is pretty much half of that as it would be if we were using the 10cm gun. Another 360 damage and holding him in place. That IS-4 is certainly tunnel visioning here. He really wanted to kill that Jagdpanzer 100. And that's what you've got to do when you're playing in the OHO in a tier 10 kind of game. You need to play that supporting role for your allies. Here we can see an IS-7. I do not think we would penetrate with 215mm of penetration. And there you go, 185 damage. You don't rack it up quickly when you're using this high explosive gun when you're shooting at very well armored tanks. But at least you are dealing damage, whereas I feel like I probably wouldn't be able to penetrate these tanks using the 10cm. What is that IS-7 doing? Is he AFK right now? Maybe he's crashed. No, he's gonna turn his gun straight towards us. He misses his shot, and we managed to... I guess we would have kept him tracked there. He uses his repair kit, another 325 damage there. So we hit that IS-7 3 times, and we only did 816 damage to him. But then again, we were shooting at some of the thickest armor in the game. We probably wouldn't have been able to penetrate that if we'd been using the 10 centimeter. And that's because we can't fire premium ammunition with that gun. If I'd been in a Tiger 2, if I'd been in an IS-3, I would have probably been able to maybe penetrate with standard rounds, as they do have 10 extra millimeters of penetration than the OHO, and are more accurate, and have better aim time, and so on and so forth. But I would probably fire APCR against an IS-7 if I was driving in a Tiger 2. And you just can't do that with the OHO. And so that's why I prefer to be using this 150mm gun. 15 centimeter gun. I should probably keep it the same, right, with my my descriptions when I'm dealing with tier 10 tanks. But then again, it is a little disappointing that I shot that IS-7 4 times, don't get the kill, and do 1,000 damage to him. But it is rather useful for just being able to whiff shots at the front of vehicles. We managed to track that T110E4, we get some assistance damage, we do 94 damage to him. We'll have to take a look in the post-game stats to see if we do any module damage to these vehicles. Shot there into the Object 704. I'm fairly sure we would have penetrated there with the 10 centimeter gun, but 313 alpha damage isn't far off the average roll of 330 that we would have done. God, there goes our ammo rack. But we don't need to worry about that right now as we blast around the corner. And hopefully we can shoot this guy. I really want to get his back so I can shoot him, but frankly I just want to shoot the top of his tank. 344 damage there, just casually shooting at the top of that T110E4. And try and make my way down the slope to ram him, but we're just too slow to be able to do any damage. So again, another fairly solid result for the OHO here. This was 1,272 base experience points, because frankly you don't have to do very much damage and assistance damage to tier 10 vehicles to get highly rewarded. And let's take a look at the kind of module damage we did to our opponents. We managed to knock out that IS-7's gunner with the 5 times we hit the vehicle. This IS-4 we took out his driver and his ammo rack, and this T110E4 we knocked out his gun and his gunner, and the 704 lost his driver. So that certainly is one of the most rewarding things about using the 15 centimeter gun, that you do damage the enemy vehicles. And when you're shooting at tier 10s and tier 9s and you're only a tier 8 heavy, that can sometimes have a big impact in the battle. Oh, and did I mention that these high explosive rounds are pretty darn cheap? Even though we fired 13 rounds this game, we only had to resupply just over 8,000 credits of ammunition and make 40k profit. Great result. And so games like these have enabled me to have fairly okay stats with the OHO. I'm very happy with my win ratio. 65% wins when I've been playing this tank mostly solo is a good result, but my average experience is rather low compared to some of my more recently played vehicles. And I guess that's because I have been using the 15 centimeter gun for pretty much most of this grind. Do you know, my biggest results actually came when I was using the 10 centimeter gun, but also some of my most atrocious results came when I was using my 10 centimeter gun when Wargaming put me in a tier 9 or a tier 10 game without premium rounds, and frankly I just didn't really feel very competitive. And I know it sounds a little bit bizarre to recommend using the 15 centimeter derp gun on this tank when I didn't use it on the tier 6 or the tier 7, but the reason for that is that their standard 10 centimeter guns just had far more penetration tier for tier, and the opportunity to load APCR, or should I say higher penetration AP for the Japanese vehicles, when you get into a bad matchmaking. And so I personally found that that was so disheartening with the spread of the OHO when I used the 10 centimeter. I got into those games where I was top tier and just completely trashed everybody, and then all the other games where you were wishing that you were firing derp rounds at higher tiered vehicles. And funnily enough, I feel like you would win those games anyway if you were using the 150mm gun. You just might not do quite so well in them because of your lower overall DPM if you don't manage to penetrate the enemy vehicles. But I feel like by using the 15 centimeter into the guns where you're not top tier, you can actually have a far bigger impact than otherwise you would have and be able to influence your win ratio. All in all, I think the OHO is pretty painless to play. It has enough armor to make its top tier games exciting and to pull off some miracle bounces against higher tiered opponents, but it is a rather cumbersome vehicle that has very big armor, and it doesn't matter if your frontal armor is 200mm thick if it's completely flat and gigantic. And as soon as the enemy caliber's guns start stepping up and up and up, your armor isn't really going to last for very long, and then you wish you were in a smaller, sleeker tank like the IS-3, which relies more on angles than just sheer thick plates. Nevertheless, the OHO can still be a very effective vehicle, and I thoroughly recommend it to players who want to rely more on their armor and maybe just bomb it around derping things, not having to know the weak points of their enemies, and just doing consistent 250 damage, 250 damage, and then maybe sometimes pulling off that magical 900 roll. So hopefully you guys enjoyed this review, or maybe it was just useful to you. If it was, please consider giving it a like down below. It really helps the channel out. And let me know in the comments down below if you agree with my opinion on the OHO, especially about the two different guns, which I really feel is the main decision that you have to make with this tank. And I also have a load of extra gameplay left over in the OHO, so when I come back from Belarus, I'm probably going to make a bonus gameplay video that I will put in that more info icon in the top right hand corner of your screen. And as always, thank you so much for watching. You've been epic, and hopefully I'll see you soon.